Unathi continues to speak to some of the delegates and speakers. Back to you then, Unathi.
That's correct, Flo, and good afternoon again. And just to remind our viewers, that in 2020, the UN, as well as the International Labour Organization, released some starking figures around, child labour, saying around 160 million children are child labourers. And in fact, that number grew from 152 in 2016. And around 92 million of those children come from the African continent. I'm now joined by Sophie de Koning. She's from the International Labour Organization. She's a specialist, especially on child labour in Africa. Sophie, thank you so much for your time, this afternoon. I mean, some of those figures are startling, particularly when you look at the figures in Africa. And I want us to talk about just the sectors where you find that there are more child labourers. We heard that the agricultural environment, 70% of those numbers are children actually are in that sector, and that's global. What are the numbers looking like in Africa specifically?
Thank you. So in Africa, the numbers are actually higher. In Africa, close to 80% of children in child labour work in the agricultural sector. They're mainly unpaid family workers, largely, almost 80%. So the other children would be found mainly in the urban informal economy, also the mining sectors.
And I mean, one of the concerning things that the Director General of the International Labour Organization said is that some of these children are between the ages of 5 and 11.
Indeed, the majority of children are aged 5 to 11. They're children that are partly out of school. There's still many children in child labour that are completely out of school, others that are combining work and a school, but we know that in the long term it may mean dropping out of school because there's no time to do the homework and so on. So we really need to give priority to younger children and make sure that they are at school and prevented from child labour. But we shouldn't forget the older children, those that are 15 and above. They have the legal age to work. They can work legally, but if they're in hazardous work, it is a worse form of child labour. So the transition from school to work and making sure that young workers have access to decent work opportunities is really also should be also a priority.
Talk to us about the key drivers, that you've seen, particularly in this continent, that leads to child labour. But I also want us to also discuss forced labour, as well as what we are now terming, modern slavery.
Mm-hmm. So with regard to child labour, I think it's interesting to look at the bigger picture. We've looked recently at the link between child labour indicators and broader development indicators. And it's quite striking to see that in Africa, for instance, child labour is prevalent really in the middle belt of Africa. And these are the countries where, where there's more poverty, where there's more informal employment, poor social protection coverage. So it's very linked to other development challenges, and these are the ones that we need to address now also as a priority.
One of the things that the Director General, who we are hoping to speak to a little bit later on, Guy Ryder, said is that he said Africa is an incubator for approaches to tackling child labour that the world can learn and benefit from. Just your thoughts and expansion on that?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We see some excellent good practices emerging from Africa. I have in mind, I'm based in Côte d'Ivoire, and I have in mind, for instance, the government of Côte d'Ivoire is putting in place national health insurance that is actually compulsory for the entire population. But we work with them to extend national health insurance, in particular to the agricultural sector, to the cocoa sector, where we know that child labour is prevalent, and looking really bottom up, trying to understand what are the challenges that the cocoa farmer meets in registering to national health insurance. We know that social protection is a great instrument to address child labour. In many African countries, these instruments are being put in place, but we need to make sure that workers in the informal economy, in the agricultural sector, where child labour is prevalent, do have access to these social protection instruments. So this is one of the examples of emerging good practices that I'm sure will inspire other countries in Africa, but also other countries in the rest of the world. Otherwise, also very interesting work that is being done at community level putting in place some child labour monitoring system really at the community level, where the community is involved in observing child labour situation, identifying children, referring them to the right person so that they can access the right services.
I mean, when we start to talk about child labour, we know that sometimes it always, carries on to becoming something worse. We mentioned modern slavery, but there's also human trafficking element. I've seen that in Ivory Coast. There's been some successes that were made recently when they rescued, I think, close to 2,000 children, that were working in the cocoa plantations. But what was concerning is that some of these children were trafficked from neighboring countries, and around 50 traffickers were arrested and also successfully convicted. But we're not seeing a lot of this, are we?
First of all, I would like to say forced labour is a broad term that encompasses certainly trafficking, and in particular child trafficking. In Africa, we also see other forms of child labour that are traditional slavery that you still see in some countries in the Sahel. Human trafficking and child trafficking in particular indeed is observed in several African countries. It's very linked to child labour. It's actually one of the worst forms of child labour. And here the ILO also has some instruments to address forced labour and human trafficking in particular. The ILO protocol that was adopted in 2014 on forced labour, that is a new instrument that has been ratified for the first time by the first country to have ratified it was actually an African country. And this is a great tool that helps member states identify what needs to be implemented to combat human trafficking and forced labour, and starting with prevention, prosecution, protection of victims of trafficking and forced labour.
Now, in 2015, this global conference, undertook to eliminate child labour by 2025. We are now in 2022. A lot of people commending that, seeing that as very ambitious, but also saying, should we be focusing on targets and goals, etc., and not concentrating perhaps at root causes and seeing what can be done from a political will perspective, instead of just meeting targets that most certainly may not be met.
I don't see a contradiction, to be honest. The targets are there; they're good. We have to be ambitious. We know at this stage that it will be difficult to reach these targeted, but we need to keep the momentum and the pressure to keep those. You mentioned the word prevention, and I would like to stress this. It's very important. The population in Africa is growing. It's a very young continent. If we keep the same prevalence that we have now, which is, it was said in the plenary, 1 child out of 5 in Africa is in child labour. If you keep that percentage and you apply it to the child population in 2025, child labour mathematically is going to increase. And we may end up with 105 million children in child labour in Africa in 2025. So we need to focus on prevention, absolutely. And for that, you need to have a good understanding of what the drivers of child labour are, and what you need is really a response at the policy level. You need the government to put the right policies and programs in place to address the root causes of child labour, and that requires also financing. So this is why I'm very excited that also for the first time in this conference, the issue of how do we finance efforts to end child labour is on the agenda, will be addressed. There's a full session on this, and it's a key issue. It's good to know what to do. It's another matter to know how you're going to finance it, right?
I'm going to squeeze this last question in because I don't actually know how much time we have. You mentioned policy level, and of course we know that some of these policies amazing. They look amazing. There's a lot of time and processes that have been put into them, but we still lack, implementation. And I'd like to ask if you're seeing this more in the African continent, or is this a global phenomena?
I think it's a global phenomenon, but certainly we observe it in Africa. So indeed, many African countries have ratified convention, adopted laws, domesticated the conventions. They're facing challenges in enforcing the law, in particular in the informal and agricultural sector, where child labour prevails. We talked about it. Many countries have adopted national action plans specifically to end child labour, but indeed they're facing challenges also to implement the measures of the national these national action plans. Among others, the issue of financing that I was talking about, and they're facing challenges in securing domestic resources to implement those national action plans.
Sophie, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. That was Sophie de Koning. She's from the International Labour Organization. She's a specialist on child labour in Africa. Of course, those numbers again, Flo, coming in there to 92 million children in the African continent are into child labour. They're child labourers, and of course that number becomes more concerning when you start to talk about 1 in 5 children potentially being child labourer, and one wonders then, will this target of 2025 be met, and if it's not, what then still needs to be done? Well, that's me from, wrapping up from Durban. So thank you so much to our viewers. And I think that was our last, interview and conversation with our delegates here at the summit. But of course, we're back tomorrow. Tomorrow, there will be plenary sessions, a number of them, all the way up until Friday, where that document, Durban Call of Action, will then be adopted by the delegates here.
All right. Thanks very much then to you, Unathi. We'll catch up with her again tomorrow, where the global conference, as she said, will indeed be continuing on the elimination of child labour.